Hello and welcome to this video lecture on Chapter 2. Today we're going to be talking about business processes, information systems, and information. All of which goes towards better communication. So if you read this first vignette in the opening part of the chapter, you can see how the group really needs some better communication and how dysfunctional the meetings are. And so if somebody had a better process, a better way of doing things, they should try and implement that in order to help the organization arrive at better decisions. And so that's what we're about in terms of thinking about our processes and automating those and delivering the correct information to the right people at the right time. And so if you look again at this vignette, you can see how when they meet, some people aren't coming to the meetings, and so they're not getting the information they need, and so they've got to go back and rehash what was discussed at the last meeting. They take phone calls during the meeting, so that gets interrupted. People aren't paying attention. People aren't reading the minutes if they're not coming to the meeting, and so there's lots of interpersonal conflict, all of which could be minimized or even resolved with proper processes in place and better information systems. So some study questions for this chapter, and hopefully you'll be able to answer those by the time we finish, is why does this Falcon security team need to understand business process? How can business process help the organizations? How can information systems help improve that quality? Then we'll spend some time talking about information and the data characteristics that are required for quality information. So as we look at this first question, why do they need to understand business process? The vignette talks about how the company is currently using drones, and so they're going to actually go from a company that buys drones to a company that makes drones. And this is a big change for that company, and so that's going to change the process in which they do things. And the way that'll impact the company is they're going to need to come up with some kind of abstraction model of the current processes. So right now they might buy a drone and fly the drone. If it crashes or fails in some way, they have to buy replacement parts, or they have to print their own replacement parts. In the future, if they start producing everything for the drone, then they're going to have to also assemble it, test it, and then put it into production. So that's going to change their processes. And as they come up with these models, they're going to have to figure out, is this really worth the company doing? Is it going to save them any time and any costs, or is it going to be able to help increase their profits? So this is why they need to understand their business processes, that not only future business processes, but the current one. Maybe there's a better way of improving on that current process than what they're currently doing. Okay, moving on to the second question is how can business process modeling help organizations? And so one thing is to come up with an abstract model of your business process. So your book is using a hypothetical bicycle part retailer named Best Bikes. And so what they are using here is a swim lane format. So they're putting each actor, if you will, into each column. And so you've got your vendor, your buyer, the website sales, operations, and customer. And then over here on the left, it's telling you what these symbols mean. So we're actually starting here. We're going to select a vendor for a product. Best Bikes is the buyer. So it goes out and it looks at the different marketing from different vendors, if you will. Then it has a dotted line to a vendor data repository. So that is if you would, a place where they're storing information. So this parallelogram, if you will, over here. The buyer also negotiates prices and terms from these vendors. Once that's done, then the vendor will ship the goods. So when it ships the goods, it's based on the operations that's needed. And the operations that's needed is probably from a warehouse of some sorts. So the warehouse has, the different quantities on hand of each of the products or parts, and it also keeps track of that information in its own repository or database. And that inventory is reduced when they sell a part. And they're selling parts through the website sales. So the website sales, they get their information based on what the buyer has ordered from the different vendors, and they keep that information in a database or repository as well. Now the last person in this process is the customer. So the customer sort of initiates everything from the website sales. You see that here, so that's some sort of activity. And once that's done, it goes into operations. They eventually ship it. They have to take it out of this database, and it's sent to the customer, and there's some kind of confirmation that the customer has that. So that's how their process actually works. Now what they're considering is printing some of the parts themselves, and so we'll look and see how that actually has an impact on this swim lane format of the processes that Best Bikes is going through. So part of what they need to decide then is, will operations do their own 3D printing? And they're going to need to use diagrams to show managers what this new structure of processes is going to look like, and what kind of changes might be in store for the company, and if there's going to be a need for additional people to work in the store. So what you have here is a revised diagram showing the different processes. And so you'll notice that there's another actor out here. That's the 3D printing. So they'll need to make the product. They'll need to check the product quality and then decide if it needs to reject or not. If they don't reject it, then it goes into this process of ship the order to the customer. And then it also needs to be updated in this repository database that we don't have this product anymore, and that it's been shipped out. So that way they know how much product they have on hand, or how much product they need to keep on hand. Also note how they changed here. They're going to do online sales, but then they're going to determine the order quantity, and then can we print it here? If yes, it goes to this process. If no, then they're going to order goods from the vendor. So then they got to go out and do the negotiation and get the best price that they can. And so that shows, or gives you some insight into how the processes are actually put into some kind of abstract form, so you can understand what's going on. If you make changes, how that impact might come about. So the third thing that we want to hopefully get out of this chapter is, how can information systems then improve that process quality? So we know that the current processes do not support 3D printing. So when we look at the dimensions of quality, we're looking at efficiency and effectiveness. So that's, efficiency is a ratio of benefits to costs. Effectiveness determines if we're doing the right thing, right? in this case, will it allow us to accomplish our strategy. So if you look at figure 2.4, I think there was a typo in the original slide. There are now only 2 vendor repositories. And let me show you what I mean by that. So if we go back and look here, we have a vendor repository here by the buyer. So we're keeping track of everything the vendor has. And we also have another vendor repository here in terms of what we're ordering and what we're keeping in a warehouse. So having 2 vendor ordered repositories means you're doubling the work. You also run the risk that if you don't update one database, you don't update the other. And so when we look at this, we're saying now a single repository is less costly, and so you won't have as many errors, and it's more effective. So we're allowing us to accomplish our strategy. So the final result then is a process that looks like this. So notice that this vendor repository or database is no longer in this lane. Okay, so that changes the processes. It's taken out. We're just going to use this right here and get that information from our vendors, but also update that from our warehouse, if you would, our operations. And so that's an abstract way of seeing where that data is being located and what we're doing with it and how we're using it. So the modeling technique that we've been using is called Business Process Modeling Notation, or BPMN. And so it doesn't show the costs directly. And so when we look at cost, it's labor that's used in all of those activities. So if somebody is maintaining that database, if somebody is actually doing the shipping of a product, that's not included in that diagram. Other things that aren't included in that diagram is the infrastructure that's needed to send that information around in the organization. So that would be things like your computer network, any email, any wireless structures that you have, anything that's needed in order to support that data flow. So you would need to include the cost of that infrastructure as part of your business process cost. So I want you to think about, how do you use information systems to improve that process? So you have different actors, different things that are going on. So hardware and people are actors that perform the action. So you got these 2. Then you've got software, and procedures are the sets of instructions. Right? So software is a set of instructions for the hardware. Procedures is a set of instructions for the people in order for them to perform. And so the data then is the bridge between the computer side and then the human side. And so what we're trying to do then is trying to automate things that procedures and people do with the data and transfer it over to the software and hardware side. In this slide we have a database that looks like Access. And so this would be the vendor information we might have kept in one portion of a database, and then this is the other information that we kept in the, say, warehouse database. By combining them together, we become more effective, and we can now look at, say, okay, in this vendor, what did they ship? So in this case, they shipped less than was ordered on this particular item, and then on this particular item, they shipped more than what was ordered. And then you also keep track of what is damaged. We can say, okay, they shipped what we ordered, but there was a significant amount that was damaged. So by combining the information into one database, we can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of that process. The next thing we want to talk about is information. And there are lots of different different definitions of information that's out there. One is it comes from data, where the data is just facts, information that doesn't contain any meaning. And so the definition I've always used and learned was that data is meaningful numbers, when you derive meaning out of a number. So let's say for a Social Security number you might have 408987777. What does that mean to you? If you didn't know it was a Social Security number, it would just be your raw information. But when I give you some meaning about it, saying it's a Social Security number, then that means a little bit more, but not much more. But what if I told you the first three numbers indicate which state you were? So now this data has some meaning and it becomes information. Some other definitions are that it's processed data, and that means you've summed it somehow, you've ordered it somehow, you've done some kind of aggregation where you're doing averaging, comparing, something like that. But again, to me, that's putting some meaning on it. Right? So last definition here is a difference that makes a difference, between data and information. And so when you look at it like that, it has value to you. It may not have value to somebody else, so it becomes different for different people. But again, I would go back is that it's going to have some kind of meaning for you. It's going to be more than just raw facts. It also has to deal with how you perceive that information. So, if you see a graph that may not have much meaning to you, may just come across as just data. But if you can get some meaning out of it, then it becomes information. And so what I was trying to get at from the last slide is this concept that people perceive different information from the same data. It just depends on how they look at it. And so here we have a graph. You just perceive it as data, and then how do you actually conceive it as information? So you look at the legends, if you will. We see this is net income over time. We see that stock price over time is relatively flat with a slight increase. Right? So that gives us some information that the stock price doesn't fluctuate as much as the net income did, which is what? If you're a finance major, if the net income goes up, the stock prices should be more valuable. But that's not the case that we see here. So by looking at this data, we have conceived some information. The next thing we want to answer is, what are some characteristics of quality information? So in this slide, you see that good information needs to be accurate, timely, and relevant, and worth the cost. And so in terms of accuracy, it needs to be accurate every time. It can't fluctuate, and sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not accurate. The example I usually talk about is water meter readers. And so when the data is input into the system, they actually input two people will input that data into the system, or used to, and then they would compare, and so then they could see if there was a typo. They could go back to the original data that was collected and see if which one was correct. But that data going into the system has to be accurate. In terms of timeliness, if the data is not current and it's not relevant or not in the context of when we need it, then it's not good information. It's not useful to us. And so that's also part of that relevant. It has to be in context. It has to be related to what we're talking about. And so it has to help us make our decisions or what we're looking at it for. Now, if it costs too much for us to acquire that information, then it's not worth it. You know, the value of perfect information is the cost that you would take to get it, and you couldn't make any money or profit with that. And what I mean by that is, let's say you could predict, you know, what horse is going to win a race. Well, what information do you need? So let's say you could gather all the information you need and predict it out 100% of the time. Well, the cost of that information would be so much that it wouldn't allow you to make any profit on a bet, because all that profit would be eaten up by the cost of you gathering the information in order to be correct. And so that's the cost of perfect information. So you want to spend enough in order to get good enough information to make a decision, but you don't want to make it so costly that it's not worth going and gathering it. So if you look at this chapter overall, hopefully it's given you some insight of how you can communicate effectively with IS professionals and colleagues using some kind of process diagramming notation. It also gives you some insight in thinking about systems and also come in with an abstraction of a process and how you can collaborate with others. And hopefully, once we get more into information systems and using that to make decisions, that will give you some more insights into different career prospects that you might have using information systems within an organization. And that ends this chapter 2.